Good afternoon, guys. I just got back to Spokane after spending the past couple years abroad. I thought I'd make a little video about what it's like living in Spokane. I'm going to talk about the cost of living, crime, the weather, things to do, jobs, education, things like that. So let's get started. I grew up here and I went to school here and I lived about 20 years of my life here. So I'm not going to claim to be an expert on the city, but I know it pretty well. Let's start with the cost of living. Spokane is about 1% below the national average, at about 30% cheaper than Seattle when it comes to cost of living. It's not a cheap place to live, but not expensive either. If you're coming from a high cost of living city, you'll find it affordable. When it comes to rent, you're looking at spending around $1,100 to $1,200 a month for a one bedroom. A studio goes for around $800 to $1,000, and a two-bedroom apartment will go for around $1,200 to $1,400 a month. To buy a home, you're looking at spending around $375,000 to $425,000 for an average home. One nice thing is that there's no state income tax in Washington. Sales tax is pretty high. It's about 9% here. Property tax isn't too bad. It's around 0.95%. I'd say an individual could live on around $35,000 to $40,000 a year, and a small family could get by on around $65,000 to $75,000 a year. Now let's talk a little bit about crime. So Spokane has a fairly high rate of crime. It's about 50% higher than the national average and almost twice the state average. That may sound high, but it's important to note that most of that crime is property crime, like theft or vandalism. So this isn't the kind of place where you can just leave your doors unlocked. Stuff will get broken into or stolen if it's not locked up. The crime rate varies quite a bit from neighborhood to neighborhood, so it's something to consider. Violent crime is pretty rare. It's not a violent city. Once in a while you'll see something in the news about a gun crime or assault or something like that, but that's usually some type of dispute. It's not just random violence. Gang crime isn't really a problem here. In that regard, it's fairly safe. You can walk around and not have to worry about getting mugged or anything like that. One issue that is pretty common here is homelessness. There are some areas downtown that are pretty sketchy, not really pleasant to walk around. It's kind of ruined downtown, honestly. There's a pretty high vacancy rate at the moment. A lot of businesses have left because the homelessness issue is so bad. There's just problems with open drug use, vandalism, petty crime, that kind of thing. Yeah, and there are also some neighborhoods that are a bit sketchy. I don't know, just lower income, just places you might not want to hang around. Not necessarily dangerous, but just not very pleasant to be around. Generally, it's safe to walk around. Now let's talk a bit about the weather. So one thing I've really grown to appreciate over the years is that Spokane has 4 distinct seasons. And at the same time, the weather doesn't get too extreme. For most of the winter, temperatures will be in the 30s and 40s for the high and 20s for the low. It might get extremely cold for 2 weeks or maybe a month per year where temperatures drop below zero. Spokane gets 44 inches of snow per year on average. You'll have to shovel occasionally throughout the winter, but it's usually not too extreme. Like this past winter, I only had to shovel maybe 3 or 4 times. Maybe every 5 years or so you'll get a particularly snowy winter. For most of the summer, the highs will be in the 70s or 80s and the lows will be in the 50s at night. You might get a month or so where temperatures are hotter in the 90s and a few days where it's over 100 degrees. The weather in the spring and fall is mild and pleasant. You can expect highs in the 50s or 60s and lows in the 30s and 40s. Spokane gets about 17 inches of rain per year. That's about half the rain that Seattle gets. If you haven't spent time in Washington State before, you might expect it to be pretty rainy, but Spokane is a fairly dry climate. Now let's talk about some things to do. Probably the biggest draw of Spokane is the nature. There are lots of lakes within an hour's drive of the city. Probably the most well-known is Lake Coeur d'Alene, which is a beautiful lake in northern Idaho. There are also several ski resorts within a couple hours of the city. The Spokane River also runs right through the city. There's some nice walking trails and hiking trails along the river, picnic areas, parks. You can go fishing in the river, rafting. It's pretty scenic. There are no professional sports teams in Spokane, but there are some semi-professional and college teams that you can watch. There's a baseball team called the Indians and a hockey team called the Chiefs. Gonzaga basketball is also really popular. There are also quite a few major events throughout the year. In the spring, there's Bloomsday, which is a 12K road race. In the summer, in July, there's a 3-on-3 basketball tournament called Hoop Fest, which is, I believe, the largest of its kind in the world. There's a county fair every year in the fall. In the summer, there's an event called Pig Out in the Park, which is a food festival. There's a parade downtown called the Lilac Parade every year in the spring. Yeah, so there are quite a few cultural events and family type events you can attend. Spokane is also a large enough city that quite a few major tours come through here. So your favorite musician or comedian might pass through town once in a while. When it comes to dining out, there are plenty of options. You'll find all your favorite chain restaurants here. You can get pretty much any kind of international food. It's not a foodie destination. I wouldn't say there's any really great restaurants, but yeah, there's plenty of options to choose from. Spokane also has quite a few green spaces. Right now I'm walking through a large park called Audubon. I used to spend time here when I was a kid. I lived pretty close. Downtown there's a large park called Riverfront. That's the biggest park in the city. That's where Expo 74 took place. On the south side of the city, there's another park called Manitou, which is also really big and beautiful. Another nice thing about Spokane is that if you want to travel to a major city, it's pretty easy to go to Seattle. It's about a 5-hour drive or an hour flight. You can also get there by bus or train. Now let's talk about jobs. So the unemployment rate currently is slightly higher than the national average. It's about 4.8%. Some of the largest sectors of employment here are healthcare, education, and government. There are several major hospitals here. So if you're in the healthcare industry, this would be a pretty good place to live. There are also lots of jobs in education. Spokane Public Schools is one of the largest employers in the city. Gonzaga and Eastern Washington University also employ lots of people. There are also quite a few government jobs available here for the city, state, and federal government. Fairchild Air Force Base is also a major employer in Spokane, so there is a military presence here as well. Spokane would also be a good choice for remote workers because the cost of living is relatively affordable. I worked remotely here for a couple of years during the pandemic, and it worked out pretty well. One thing Spokane is kind of lacking is high-paying jobs. You won't find many jobs in tech or finance or entertainment that pay big wages like you would find in a major city. Most jobs are pretty average. When it comes to education, Spokane has an above-average public school system. The graduation rate is over 90%. I went to Spokane Public Schools for kindergarten through high school, and I can't really complain. There are several universities in town, including Gonzaga, Whitman, Eastern Washington University is not far away. It's a decent place to get an education. So to wrap things up, Spokane isn't the best place in the world to live, but it's not a terrible place either. It's a pretty friendly and welcoming city. The locals have kind of a love-hate relationship with it. They love to complain about it, but most people tend to stick around. Anyway, if you guys have found this video helpful, please subscribe. I'll be making some more Spokane videos until I hit the road again. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.